I never thought my fitness journey would turn into the most important battle of my life. For months, I had been religiously attending CrossFit Phoenix, a premium gym in downtown Seattle that prided itself on being a safe space for women to push their limits. The facility was beautiful, with floor-to-ceiling windows, state-of-the-art equipment, and what I believed to be the most supportive community I had ever been part of. Every morning at 6 a.m. sharp, I would walk through those glass doors, ready to tackle whatever brutal workout awaited me. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The gym had become more than just a place to exercise for me. After my divorce 2 years earlier, I had struggled with confidence, self-worth, and finding my place in the world again. CrossFit Phoenix represented a fresh start, a chance to rebuild not just my physical strength but my mental resilience as well. The other women there had become like sisters to me, encouraging each other through grueling workouts, celebrating personal records, and sharing the vulnerable moments that come with pushing your body to its absolute limit. What made the gym truly special was Marcus Rivera, our head trainer. At 32, Marcus had the kind of presence that commanded respect the moment he walked into a room. He was incredibly knowledgeable about fitness, patient with beginners, and had an uncanny ability to motivate even the most reluctant athletes to exceed their own expectations. Marcus had been working with me personally for 8 months, helping me transform from someone who could barely complete a modified push-up to someone who was deadlifting twice my body weight and completing workouts I never dreamed possible. The trust I placed in Marcus was absolute. He had seen me at my most vulnerable, catching me when I failed on heavy lifts, encouraging me through tears of frustration, and celebrating every small victory along the way. When I mentioned struggling with my form on certain movements, he would stay after hours to work with me privately, never charging extra for the time. He seemed genuinely invested in my success, in all of our success, and his dedication to the women at the gym appeared unwavering. The locker room at CrossFit Phoenix was designed to be a sanctuary. It was spacious and modern, with individual changing stalls, premium amenities, and what we all believed to be complete privacy. The women would gather there before and after workouts, sharing stories about their lives, discussing challenges they were facing, and supporting each other through everything from career changes to relationship struggles. It was in that locker room that I had found some of my closest friendships, where vulnerability was met with understanding, and where we all felt completely safe to be ourselves. Marcus had always been respectful of boundaries. He would knock loudly before entering if he needed to address something related to equipment or safety, always giving us plenty of warning and ensuring we were comfortable with his presence. His professionalism was one of the things that made the gym feel so secure for all of us. We trusted him implicitly, not just with our fitness goals, but with our safety and privacy. The first sign that something was wrong came on a Thursday morning in October. I had arrived early for my usual 6 a.m. session, eager to tackle a particularly challenging workout that Marcus had programmed for us. As I pushed through the main entrance, I noticed the gym was unusually quiet. Typically, there would be at least a few early risers already warming up, but today the main floor was empty except for the soft hum of the ventilation system. I made my way toward the women's locker room, thinking nothing of the solitude. Sometimes the early morning crowd varied depending on weather or work schedules, and I actually enjoyed having the space to myself occasionally. It allowed me to focus more deeply on my pre-workout routine and mentally prepare for the physical challenges ahead. As I approached the locker room door, I heard a sound that made me pause. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but there was definitely something electronic beeping rhythmically from inside. My first thought was that someone had left their phone or fitness tracker behind, probably in one of the lockers. I pushed the door open gently, expecting to find the source of the sound and perhaps return the device to the front desk. The locker room appeared empty, but the beeping continued. I followed the sound, walking past the benches and around the corner toward the changing stalls. That's when I saw it. Perched on top of one of the highest lockers, barely visible unless you were looking for it, was a small black device no bigger than a matchbox. A tiny red light blinked steadily, and I realized with growing horror that this wasn't someone's forgotten gadget. My heart began to race as the implications sank in. This was a recording device, positioned at the perfect angle to capture everything that happened in the changing area. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as I thought about all the times I had changed clothes in this space, all the private conversations I had shared with other women, all the moments of vulnerability that we had believed were completely private. I stood frozen for several moments, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. Who could have placed this here? When? How long had it been recording? The questions swirled through my head as I tried to make sense of the violation that was unfolding before me. The safe space that had meant so much to me, to all of us, had been compromised in the most invasive way possible. My hands trembled as I reached for my phone, instinctively wanting to document what I had found. But before I could even unlock the screen, I heard footsteps approaching the locker room, heavy, familiar footsteps that I recognized immediately. Marcus was coming. Panic flooded through me as I realized the position I was in. If Marcus was the one responsible for this device, finding me here could be dangerous. But if he wasn't, then I needed to tell him immediately about what I had discovered. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours as I tried to decide what to do. The footsteps grew closer, and I knew I had to make a choice. I quickly stepped into one of the changing stalls, pulling the curtain closed just as the locker room door opened. My heart was pounding so loudly I was certain it could be heard throughout the entire space. I held my breath, pressing myself against the wall of the stall, trying to remain as quiet as possible while straining to hear what was happening outside. The footsteps moved purposefully through the locker room, not the casual gait of someone checking for forgotten items or doing routine maintenance. These were the steps of someone who knew exactly where they were going and what they were looking for. I heard the sound of something being moved, a soft scraping against metal that made my stomach drop. Through the narrow gap at the bottom of the stall curtain, I could see a pair of athletic shoes that I recognized immediately. They were Marcus's signature training shoes, the ones he wore every single day, the ones I had seen him lace up countless times before our sessions. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Marcus, the trainer I trusted completely, the man who had helped rebuild my confidence and strength, was standing just feet away from me, tampering with what I now knew was his hidden recording device. I watched in horrified silence as he moved efficiently around the space, clearly familiar with his routine. The soft sounds of electronic devices being handled drifted through the air, and I realized with growing dread that there wasn't just one camera. There were multiple devices hidden throughout the locker room, and Marcus was systematically checking each one. The betrayal I felt in that moment was unlike anything I had ever experienced. This wasn't just a violation of privacy. It was a complete destruction of trust from someone who had positioned himself as a protector and mentor. Every encouraging word he had spoken, every moment of seeming genuine care and support, now felt tainted and manipulative. Had his kindness and attention been nothing more than a way to gain our trust so he could violate our privacy more effectively? I thought about all the women who used this locker room daily. Sarah, a young mother of 2 who was working to regain her strength after childbirth. Jennifer, a survivor of domestic violence who had found empowerment through fitness. Michelle, a teenager whose parents had enrolled her in the gym to build confidence. All of us had trusted Marcus completely, had seen him as someone who genuinely cared about our well-being and success. The sounds of Marcus's activity continued for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes. I heard him moving between different areas of the locker room, the soft clicks and beeps of electronic devices being manipulated. At one point, he paused directly outside my stall, and I was certain he could hear my heart hammering against my ribs. I held my breath until my lungs burned, afraid that even the slightest sound would give away my presence. Finally, after what seemed like hours, I heard his footsteps retreating toward the door. The locker room fell silent again, but I remained frozen in the stall for several more minutes, making absolutely certain he was gone before I dared to move. When I finally emerged, My legs were shaking so badly I could barely stand. I looked up at the locker where I had first spotted the device, and my heart sank. It was gone. Marcus had removed it, along with whatever other recording equipment he had hidden throughout the space. The evidence of his violation had been erased, but the knowledge of what I had witnessed would be burned into my memory forever. The weight of the situation settled over me like a suffocating blanket. I wasn't just dealing with a violation of my own privacy. I was sitting on knowledge of a crime that was affecting every woman who used this facility. The responsibility felt overwhelming. How could I prove what I had seen? Who would believe me without evidence? And how could I protect the other women from ongoing violation while I figured out what to do? I stumbled toward one of the benches and sat down heavily, my mind racing through possibilities and consequences. If I reported this to the gym management, Marcus would likely deny everything. And without the physical evidence I had just watched him remove, it would be his word against mine. If I went to the police, I would face the same problem. The thought of trying to convince people that Marcus, the beloved and respected trainer, was secretly recording women felt daunting and potentially futile. But doing nothing wasn't an option. Every day that passed meant more women were being violated, more private moments were being stolen and recorded without consent. The thought of Sarah changing clothes after her workout, completely unaware that her most vulnerable moments were being captured, made me feel physically sick. The idea of Jennifer, who had worked so hard to reclaim her sense of safety and empowerment, being secretly recorded by the very person she trusted to help her heal, filled me with a rage I had never experienced before. As I sat in that violated space, trying to process the magnitude of what I had discovered, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to let Marcus get away with this. I wasn't going to allow him to continue violating the women who trusted him. Somehow, some way, I was going to find a way to expose the truth and protect the community that had become so important to me. The old me, the one who had walked into this gym 8 months earlier broken and uncertain, might have been too intimidated to take action. But the woman I had become, strengthened by months of pushing through physical and mental barriers, wasn't going to back down from this fight. Marcus had made a critical error in his assessment of who he was dealing with. He saw us as victims to be exploited, but he was about to learn that he had underestimated the strength and determination of the women he had chosen to violate. I pulled out my phone and began documenting everything I could remember about what I had witnessed. The time, the location of the devices I had seen, the sounds I had heard, Marcus's movements and behavior. Every detail, no matter how small, could potentially be important later. I knew that building a case against him would require patience, strategy, and irrefutable evidence. As I prepared to leave the locker room, I took one last look around the space that had once felt so safe and welcoming. The violation of that sanctuary felt like a personal attack, not just on me, but on every woman who had found strength and community within these walls. Marcus had stolen something precious from all of us, but I was determined to make sure his theft came with a price he never expected to pay. The morning workout session was beginning, and I could hear other women arriving at the gym. I listened to their cheerful voices and casual conversation, knowing that they had no idea what had just transpired in the space they considered safe. The urge to warn them immediately was overwhelming, but I knew that acting too quickly could jeopardize any chance of holding Marcus accountable for his actions. I forced myself to take deep breaths and compose my expression before leaving the locker room. I had to appear normal, had to interact with Marcus as if nothing had changed, while internally I was planning his downfall. The performance required would be challenging, but I had learned over the past months that I was capable of much more than I had ever imagined. As I walked back into the main gym area, Marcus looked up from where he was setting up equipment for the morning class. He smiled at me with the same warm, encouraging expression he had shown me hundreds of times before. But now, instead of feeling supported and motivated by that smile, I felt disgusted and manipulated. Every interaction we had ever had was now colored by the knowledge of his deception and violation. The other women were beginning to filter in for the morning session, greeting each other with the easy camaraderie that had made this place feel like home. Sarah waved enthusiastically from across the room, excited to share that she had finally mastered a movement she had been struggling with for weeks. Jennifer smiled shyly but confidently, her transformation over the past months evident in her posture and demeanor. These women, my friends, had no idea that their trust and vulnerability were being exploited by the very person they looked to for guidance and support. Marcus began the workout briefing, explaining the movements and intensity level for the day's session. His voice carried the same authority and expertise it always had, but now I heard it differently. Instead of a knowledgeable coach sharing his passion for fitness, I heard a predator who had perfected the art of gaining trust while simultaneously violating it. The cognitive dissonance was almost unbearable. Throughout the workout, I found it nearly impossible to focus on the physical movements. My mind was consumed with planning and strategy, trying to figure out how to gather the evidence I would need to expose Marcus and protect the other women. Every time he offered me correction or encouragement, I had to fight the urge to confront him immediately. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The self-control required to maintain the facade of normalcy while my world had been turned upside down was exhausting. As the session concluded and the other women headed toward the locker room to change and shower, I felt a fresh wave of urgency and protectiveness. They were walking unknowingly into the space where their privacy was being violated, trusting in the safety that Marcus had systematically destroyed. The weight of my secret knowledge felt crushing, but I knew that revealing it prematurely could ruin any chance of bringing him to justice. I made an excuse about needing to leave quickly for a work meeting and gathered my things without changing clothes. As I walked toward the exit, Marcus called out to me with what appeared to be genuine concern about my abbreviated post-workout routine. The ease with which he maintained his caring facade while knowing what he had been doing just an hour earlier in that locker room made my skin crawl. Once I was safely in my car, the magnitude of the situation hit me with full force. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my hands shaking as the adrenaline from the morning's discovery began to wear off. The violation I had uncovered wasn't just about privacy. It was about power, manipulation, and the exploitation of trust. Marcus had weaponized his position of authority and used it to victimize the very women who had placed their faith in him. The drive home passed in a blur as my mind raced through potential courses of action. I knew that whatever I decided to do would have far-reaching consequences, not just for Marcus, but for the entire gym community. The women who trained there would be devastated to learn that their safe space had been compromised. The gym's reputation would be destroyed, potentially affecting the livelihoods of innocent employees. But none of those considerations could outweigh the imperative to stop Marcus from continuing his violations and to seek justice for what he had already done. As I pulled into my driveway, I made a decision that would define the next chapter of my life. I wasn't going to be a passive victim of Marcus's betrayal. I was going to become the architect of his downfall, and I was going to make sure that every woman he had violated received the justice they deserved. The strength I had built over months of physical training was about to be tested in a completely different arena, but I was ready for the challenge. The battle ahead would require everything I had learned about perseverance, strategy, and pushing through obstacles that seemed insurmountable. Marcus had chosen the wrong women to target, and he was about to discover that the community he had violated was stronger and more determined than he had ever imagined. His workout was indeed about to get much, much harder. Once inside my apartment, I collapsed onto my couch, finally allowing myself to process the full weight of what I had witnessed. The familiar surroundings of my home felt different now, like everything had shifted slightly off axis. The coffee mug I had left on the kitchen counter that morning, the book I had been reading the night before, the workout clothes laid out for tomorrow's session. All of it seemed to belong to a different version of myself, one who still believed the world was a safer place than it actually was. I reached for my laptop and opened a new document, my fingers hovering over the keyboard as I tried to decide where to begin. The details of the morning were burned into my memory with crystal clarity, but organizing them into something coherent felt overwhelming. I started with the timeline, documenting everything from the moment I arrived at the gym to my escape in the parking lot. Every sound, every movement, every detail that might prove relevant later was carefully recorded. As I typed, a new realization began to crystallize. This wasn't something that had just started happening. The sophistication of Marcus's setup, the way he moved through the locker room with such familiarity and efficiency, suggested this had been going on for a long time. Months, possibly even years. The thought made me physically ill as I considered how many women had been violated without their knowledge, how many private moments had been stolen and recorded. I thought about my own journey at the gym, replaying interactions with Marcus through this new lens of understanding. Had there been signs I had missed? Moments when his behavior should have raised red flags? I remembered times when he had seemed particularly interested in our schedules, when he would ask detailed questions about our routines and preferences. At the time, I had interpreted this as dedication to providing personalized training. Now I wondered if he had been gathering intelligence for more sinister purposes. The laptop screen blurred as tears of rage and frustration filled my eyes. This wasn't just about the violation of privacy, though that was devastating enough. It was about the complete destruction of trust in a space that had meant everything to me and the other women who trained there. Marcus had weaponized our vulnerability, turning our moments of greatest authenticity against us. I closed the laptop and walked to my kitchen, needing to move, to do something with the restless energy that was building inside me. As I mechanically prepared a cup of tea, my mind began working through the practical challenges ahead. Without physical evidence of the recording devices, proving Marcus's crimes would be nearly impossible. It would be my word against his, and I knew how those situations typically played out. The respected, charismatic trainer versus the emotional woman making wild accusations. But I wasn't without resources. Over the 8 months I had been training at CrossFit Phoenix, I had become close friends with several other women who used the facility regularly. More importantly, I had professional skills that Marcus had no idea about. Before my divorce, I had worked in digital forensics for a cybersecurity firm. The technical knowledge I had gained during those years, combined with my understanding of how predators operated in digital spaces, might give me the edge I needed. The first step was reconnaissance. I needed to understand the full scope of Marcus's operation before I could effectively dismantle it. That meant returning to the gym and finding a way to document the recording devices without alerting him to my knowledge. It would require careful planning and nerves of steel, but I had both in abundance. I spent the rest of the day researching hidden camera detection methods and ordering specialized equipment online. Thermal imaging devices, radio frequency detectors, and ultra-compact cameras of my own, tools that would help me gather the evidence I needed while staying under Marcus's radar. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was planning to secretly record the person who had been secretly recording us, but justice sometimes required fighting fire with fire. That evening, I called my closest friend from the gym, Lisa Chen, a brilliant software engineer who had become like a sister to me over the past months. Lisa had always been perceptive, and I wondered if she had noticed anything unusual about Marcus's behavior. More importantly, she had technical skills that could complement my own in the investigation ahead. When Lisa answered the phone, her voice carried the usual warmth and energy that had drawn me to her friendship. We chatted briefly about mundane topics before I carefully steered the conversation toward more serious territory. Without revealing what I had discovered, I asked her about her comfort level with Marcus and whether she had ever felt that anything was off about the gym environment. Lisa's response was immediate and concerning. She had actually been feeling uncomfortable lately but hadn't been able to pinpoint why. There were small things. Marcus seeming to know details about conversations she was certain he hadn't overheard, his presence near the locker room at odd times, and a general feeling of being watched that she had attributed to paranoia. Her intuition had been trying to warn her, but like me, she had trusted Marcus too completely to listen to those warning signals. The conversation with Lisa confirmed my suspicions that other women had been picking up on subtle signs of Marcus's predatory behavior. Our training in fitness had taught us to trust our bodies and instincts, but our trust in Marcus had overridden those same instincts when they tried to warn us about him. It was a manipulation tactic as old as time. Abusers who positioned themselves as protectors, making their victims doubt their own perceptions. Over the next several days, I developed a comprehensive plan for exposing Marcus while protecting the women he had victimized. The strategy had multiple phases, each designed to build toward an irrefutable case that would not only result in his prosecution, but also ensure that no other women would fall victim to his predatory behavior. Phase 1 involved documenting the current state of his surveillance operation. I would need to return to the gym during off hours and systematically locate every recording device he had hidden. This required careful timing and preparation, as getting caught would not only ruin my investigation, but potentially put me in physical danger. I spent hours studying the gym's schedule and security protocols, identifying windows of opportunity when the facility would be empty but accessible. The gym offered 24-hour access to premium members, which I was, but the overnight hours were typically deserted, except for the occasional insomniac looking for a late-night workout. Marcus had his own key and alarm code, but according to the membership agreement, he wasn't supposed to be in the building outside of regular staffed hours without prior approval. The specialized detection equipment I had ordered arrived within 48 hours, and I spent an entire evening learning to use each device effectively. The radio frequency detector would help me locate any wireless cameras or transmitters. The thermal imaging camera would reveal heat signatures from electronic devices, even when they were cleverly hidden. My own micro cameras would allow me to document everything I found with timestamp and location data that could be used as evidence. During this preparation phase, I maintained my regular workout schedule at the gym, forcing myself to interact normally with Marcus, while internally I was planning his downfall. The cognitive dissonance was exhausting, but it was also educational. I began paying attention to details I had previously overlooked, the way he positioned himself to observe the locker room entrance, how he timed his movements around our schedules, and the subtle ways he gathered information about our personal lives. Marcus seemed completely oblivious to any change in my behavior, which told me something important about his psychology. He was so confident in his control over the situation that he wasn't looking for signs of suspicion or resistance. This arrogance would work to my advantage, but it also made me more determined to bring him down. His casual assumption that we were all too naive or powerless to threaten him revealed the depth of his contempt for the women he was supposed to be helping. 3 days after my initial discovery, I put my plan into action. I arrived at the gym at 2 a.m, using my keycard to enter through the main entrance. The facility was eerily quiet, with only the emergency lighting providing illumination. I had worn all black clothing and soft-soled shoes to minimize any noise that might trigger the building's security systems or alert neighboring businesses to my presence. The women's locker room felt different in the darkness, more sinister and threatening than it had ever seemed during daylight hours. I switched on my detection equipment and began a systematic sweep of the entire space, starting with the areas where I had witnessed Marcus operating days earlier. The radio frequency detector immediately began registering signals near the changing stalls. Following the strongest readings, I located the first device hidden behind a ventilation grate, positioned to capture a wide-angle view of the changing area. The sophistication of the setup was disturbing. This wasn't a hastily placed amateur operation, but a carefully planned surveillance system that had obviously been in place for an extended period. Using my thermal imaging camera, I identified heat signatures from multiple electronic devices throughout the locker room. There were cameras hidden in air vents, behind ceiling tiles, and even built into what appeared to be standard fixtures. The scope of the surveillance was far beyond what I had initially imagined. Marcus had turned the entire locker room into a recording studio, with multiple angles and overlapping coverage areas ensuring that nothing went unobserved. As I documented each device with my own cameras, I felt a growing sense of rage at the violation this represented. Every woman who had used this space had been unknowingly performing for Marcus's private entertainment. Our most vulnerable moments, our private conversations, our struggles with body image and self-acceptance, all of it had been captured and recorded for his gratification. But the discovery that made my blood run cold was finding devices that weren't just in the locker room. Marcus had also placed cameras in the main workout area, positioned to capture upskirt and other compromising angles during exercises. The women of CrossFit Phoenix had been unknowingly providing content for what was essentially a pornographic operation, with Marcus profiting from our trust and vulnerability. The workout area cameras were more challenging to locate because they had to blend seamlessly with the gym equipment and environment. But once I knew what to look for, I found them everywhere. Cameras built into equipment bases, hidden in wall-mounted fixtures, and even embedded in the mirrors that lined the workout space. The entire facility had been compromised, turning what we believed was a safe space for empowerment into a venue for exploitation. As I worked through the night, cataloging and documenting each violation, I began to understand the true scope of Marcus's operation. This wasn't just about satisfying some personal perversion. This was a systematic business built on the exploitation of women's trust. The quality and placement of the equipment suggested significant financial investment, which meant he was likely monetizing the content he was capturing. The thought that intimate moments stolen from me and my friends might be circulating on the internet, being purchased and consumed by strangers, added a new dimension of violation to an already devastating situation. We hadn't just been secretly recorded. We had potentially been trafficked without our knowledge or consent. By 4 a.m, I had documented over 20 separate recording devices throughout the facility. The evidence I had gathered was comprehensive and damning, with detailed photographs showing each device's location and capabilities. But I knew that simply removing or destroying the cameras wouldn't be enough. Marcus would know his operation had been discovered, and he would have time to destroy any stored footage and disappear before he could be held accountable. Instead, I needed to find where he was storing the recorded content and gathering evidence of how he was distributing or monetizing it. The cameras I had found were sophisticated enough to stream content wirelessly, which meant there was likely a central collection point where everything was being stored and processed. I began examining the technical specifications of the devices I had found, looking for clues about how Marcus's system operated. The cameras were all connected to a local network, which meant there had to be a central server or storage system somewhere in the building. Finding that system would give me access to the full extent of his crimes and provide the evidence needed to ensure his prosecution. My search led me to Marcus's office, a space I had only been in a few times for consultations about my training progress. Using my detection equipment, I discovered that his office contained the central hub for his entire surveillance operation. Hidden behind false panels and inside modified equipment were servers, storage devices, and networking equipment that formed the backbone of his recording system. The office also contained evidence of the business side of his operation. Financial records hidden in encrypted files showed payments from various online platforms, where he was apparently selling the content he was stealing from his clients. The amounts were staggering. Marcus was making more money from violating our privacy than he was from his legitimate training business. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery was a detailed database he had created about each woman who trained at the gym. The files contained not just our personal information and schedules, but also his observations about our vulnerabilities, insecurities, and potential value as content creators. We weren't clients to him. We were products in his catalog, each carefully assessed for our entertainment potential. Reading through his notes about me was particularly sickening. He had documented my divorce, my struggles with self-confidence, and my gratitude for his training assistance. All of the personal information I had shared with him, thinking we had developed a mentoring relationship, had been cataloged and analyzed for ways to better exploit me. As dawn approached, I began copying files from Marcus's servers to external drives I had brought with me. The amount of content was enormous, years' worth of recordings from dozens of women who had trusted him with their fitness journeys. The scope of his crimes was far beyond anything I had initially imagined, and I knew that bringing him to justice would require more than just local law enforcement. The evidence I was gathering would support charges of voyeurism, sexual exploitation, computer crimes, and potentially sex trafficking, if he was selling content across state lines. This was federal crime territory, which meant I would need to involve agencies with the resources and jurisdiction to properly investigate and prosecute Marcus's operation. But first, I needed to complete my documentation and ensure that I had captured enough evidence to guarantee his conviction. Marcus's confidence and carelessness had made him sloppy about protecting his operation, assuming that the women he was exploiting would never suspect or challenge him. That arrogance was about to become his downfall. As I prepared to leave the gym with my evidence, I took one last look around the locker room that had meant so much to me and the other women who trained here. Soon, this space would be safe again, and Marcus would be facing the consequences of his crimes. The violation he had perpetrated against us was about to be turned back on him, and the community he had exploited would be the force that brought him down. The sun was beginning to rise as I made my way home, my car loaded with evidence that would destroy Marcus's life just as thoroughly as he had violated ours. The investigation phase was complete, and now it was time to move into the execution phase of my plan. Marcus had built his operation on the assumption that we were powerless to stop him, but he was about to learn just how wrong he had been about the strength and determination of the women he had chosen to target. My apartment had transformed into a war room over the following week. Multiple monitors displayed surveillance footage, financial records, and network diagrams that mapped out Marcus's entire operation. External hard drives containing terabytes of evidence lined my desk, each one labeled with meticulous detail about its contents. I had barely slept, surviving on coffee and determination as I prepared for what would be the most important presentation of my life. The FBI field office in Seattle had initially been skeptical when I called requesting a meeting about a cybercrime operation. But when I mentioned the scope of the evidence I had gathered and the interstate nature of the content distribution, they agreed to hear me out. Special Agent Rebecca Torres, who specialized in technology-facilitated sexual exploitation cases, would be reviewing my findings the following Monday. But I wasn't content to simply hand over the evidence and hope for the best. Marcus had violated every woman who trusted him, and justice demanded more than a quiet arrest and prosecution. He needed to face the consequences publicly, in front of the community he had betrayed. The women he had exploited deserved to see him held accountable, and other potential victims needed to understand how predators could hide behind positions of trust and authority. Lisa had become my closest ally in planning what we privately called Operation Exposure. Her technical expertise complemented my investigative skills perfectly, and her anger at Marcus's betrayal burned just as fiercely as my own. Together, we had developed a strategy that would simultaneously alert law enforcement, warn the gym community, and ensure that Marcus faced maximum consequences for his crimes. The timing had to be perfect. We needed to coordinate the evidence handover to federal agents with a public revelation that would prevent Marcus from destroying additional evidence or fleeing. The gym's annual member appreciation event, scheduled for that Saturday evening, would provide the ideal venue for our confrontation. Marcus would be trapped in a room full of his victims, with no escape route and no way to deny the evidence that would be displayed for everyone to see. But first, I needed to ensure that the women most severely impacted by his crimes were prepared for what was coming. Sarah, Jennifer, Michelle, and a dozen others who had become close friends deserved advance warning about the violation they had suffered. This conversation would be one of the most difficult things I had ever done, but they had a right to know before the information became public. I arranged to meet with the core group of women who formed the heart of our gym community at a coffee shop downtown, far from Marcus's potential surveillance. When I walked into the cafe that Friday evening, their faces reflected the easy camaraderie that had developed between us over months of shared struggles and victories. That warmth would soon turn to horror and betrayal, but they needed to hear the truth from someone who cared about them, rather than discovering it in a more traumatic way. Sarah was the first to notice my serious expression, her smile fading as she studied my face. Jennifer, always sensitive to emotional undercurrents, immediately asked if something was wrong. The weight of what I was about to tell them felt crushing, but there was no gentle way to deliver this kind of devastating news. I began by explaining that I had discovered something terrible about Marcus and the gym, something that affected all of us personally. The women around the table grew increasingly tense as I outlined the surveillance operation I had uncovered, their faces transitioning from confusion to disbelief to horrified understanding. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth when I described the scope of the recording devices. Jennifer's eyes filled with tears as the implications sank in. Michelle, barely 18 and so proud of the confidence she had gained through fitness, looked like she might be physically sick. The questions came in a torrent once the initial shock wore off. How long had this been happening? What exactly had been recorded? Where was the footage now? Who else knew? Each answer I provided seemed to deepen their anguish, but I forced myself to be completely honest about everything I had discovered. They deserved to know the full extent of the violation they had suffered. Lisa, who had been quietly supportive throughout the conversation, began explaining the technical aspects of what we had found. The sophistication of Marcus's operation, the evidence of content distribution, and the financial records showing he had been profiting from their exploitation. Her calm, methodical explanation helped ground the emotional devastation in concrete facts that could be acted upon. But it was Jennifer who asked the question that mattered most. What were we going to do about it? The room fell silent as everyone looked at me, and I realized that my answer would shape not just Marcus's fate but the healing process for every woman he had victimized. These women needed to know that their violation wouldn't go unpunished, that their trust hadn't been misplaced in me, even though it had been catastrophically misplaced in Marcus. I outlined our plan for the member appreciation event, explaining how we would coordinate with law enforcement to ensure Marcus faced both criminal prosecution and public accountability. The evidence would be presented in a way that left no room for denial or manipulation, and the entire gym community would understand exactly what had been done to them. The reaction was immediate and unanimous. Every woman at that table wanted to be part of bringing Marcus down. Sarah, despite her devastation, declared that she wouldn't let him get away with violating her daughter's potential future at the gym. Jennifer, drawing on the strength she had developed through surviving domestic violence, said she refused to be anyone's victim ever again. Michelle, young but fierce, wanted to ensure that no other teenage girls would experience what she had unknowingly endured. That evening marked a turning point in our group dynamic. We were no longer just friends who worked out together. We had become a sisterhood united by shared violation and determined to seek justice. The bonds that Marcus had tried to exploit for his own gratification had instead become the foundation for his destruction. Saturday morning arrived with deceptive normalcy. I attended my regular workout session, forcing myself to interact with Marcus as if nothing had changed while internally I was counting down the hours until his exposure. He seemed relaxed and confident, joking with the women as they went through their exercises, completely oblivious to the storm that was about to engulf him. During the session, I watched him with new eyes, cataloging the subtle ways he positioned himself to observe the women, how he engineered opportunities for physical contact during spotting, and the careful attention he paid to personal information shared during conversations. Every interaction was a predatory calculation disguised as professional care, and I marveled at how effectively he had fooled us all. The member appreciation event was scheduled to begin at 7 that evening, with Marcus planning to give a presentation about the gym's growth and future plans. What he didn't know was that his presentation would be interrupted by a very different kind of slideshow, one that would destroy his life as thoroughly as he had violated ours. Agent Torres and her team had reviewed the evidence I provided and confirmed that it supported multiple federal charges against Marcus. They would be positioned around the venue during the event, ready to arrest him the moment his crimes were publicly revealed. The coordination between the public exposure and law enforcement action would ensure he had no opportunity to destroy additional evidence or contact potential accomplices. As I prepared for the evening, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. 8 months earlier, I had walked into CrossFit Phoenix as a broken woman seeking to rebuild her life after divorce. I had found strength, community, and purpose, only to discover that my sanctuary had been systematically violated by the person I trusted most. But that violation had also revealed a strength I didn't know I possessed, a determination to fight for justice that went beyond my own personal healing. The venue for the member appreciation event was the hotel ballroom adjacent to the gym, decorated with photos celebrating the achievements of various members over the past year. Seeing those images of triumph and empowerment, knowing now that many of them had been captured during moments when the women were being secretly recorded, added another layer of violation to Marcus's crimes. He had stolen not just our privacy, but our joy in our accomplishments. Marcus was in his element as the evening began, working the room with the charismatic confidence that had made him so effective at gaining our trust. He spoke passionately about the gym's mission to empower women through fitness, his words dripping with irony given what we now knew about his true activities. Several times during his mingling, I caught him looking in my direction with what appeared to be genuine warmth and appreciation. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. At 8 o'clock, Marcus took the stage to begin his formal presentation. He spoke about the gym's growth, the success stories of individual members, and his vision for expanding the facility to help even more women achieve their fitness goals. The audience was engaged and enthusiastic, applauding at appropriate moments and clearly inspired by his apparent passion for their well-being. But 20 minutes into his presentation, the atmosphere in the room began to shift. Lisa, positioned at the back of the ballroom with our prepared evidence, had gained access to the presentation system through a vulnerability she had identified in the hotel's network. As Marcus clicked to advance to his next slide, the screen instead displayed a very different image. The first photograph showed one of the hidden cameras we had discovered in the locker room, with a timestamp and location marker clearly visible. The room fell silent as people struggled to understand what they were seeing. Marcus stopped mid-sentence, his face going pale as he realized his presentation had been hijacked. The second image was even more damning. A screenshot from Marcus's own files showing the database he had created about gym members, complete with personal information and his predatory assessments of each woman's potential value. Gasps and murmurs of confusion began to ripple through the audience as the implications started to sink in. But it was the third image that caused the room to erupt. A photograph of Marcus's server room, clearly showing the sophisticated equipment he had been using to record and store surveillance footage of gym members. The date and timestamps proved the images were recent, and the technical sophistication visible in the setup made it clear this was no amateur operation. Marcus frantically tried to regain control of the presentation system, but Lisa had locked him out completely. He began speaking rapidly, trying to dismiss the images as some kind of mistake or malicious attack, but his panic was obvious to everyone in the room. The confident, charismatic trainer had disappeared, replaced by a desperate man whose secret had been exposed. The fourth slide displayed financial records showing payments Marcus had received from adult content platforms, with amounts and dates that proved he had been monetizing the surveillance footage he had captured. The room erupted in horrified gasps as people began to understand the full scope of what had been done to them. Sarah stood up in the middle of the ballroom, her voice carrying clearly as she demanded to know if what they were seeing was real. Jennifer followed, asking if Marcus had been recording them without consent. One by one, the women who had been briefed the night before began standing and voicing their outrage, creating a wall of accusation that Marcus couldn't deflect or deny. The final slide was the most devastating. A compilation of screenshots from various adult websites, where content featuring gym members had been posted for sale. The faces had been blurred to protect the victim's privacy, but the gym's distinctive interior was clearly visible in the background. The evidence was irrefutable and damning, leaving no room for Marcus to claim innocence or misunderstanding. As the full horror of the situation became clear to the entire room, Marcus made a desperate attempt to leave the stage. But Agent Torres and her team were already moving, their FBI credentials clearly visible as they approached from multiple directions. His path to every exit was blocked, and the reality of his situation was finally sinking in. The arrest was swift and professional, but the impact on the room was electric. Women who had trusted Marcus completely were now seeing him led away in handcuffs, finally understanding the depth of his betrayal. Some were crying, others were shouting questions or accusations, and many simply stood in stunned silence as they processed the magnitude of what had been revealed. In the chaos that followed Marcus's arrest, I found myself surrounded by women seeking answers, comfort, and guidance about what would happen next. The community that Marcus had violated was already beginning to heal, drawing strength from their shared outrage and determination to support each other through the legal process ahead. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came as Marcus was being led from the ballroom. He looked directly at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of rage and disbelief, and I met his gaze with the steady confidence of someone who had fought for justice and won. The last words he heard before being taken into custody came from Sarah, who called out that his victims were stronger than he had ever imagined. The weeks that followed were challenging but ultimately rewarding. Marcus was charged with multiple federal crimes related to a surveillance operation, and the evidence we had gathered ensured that his prosecution would be successful. The gym underwent complete renovation, with new management and enhanced security measures that would prevent future violations. More importantly, the women who had been victimized found strength in their shared experience and mutual support. What Marcus had intended as exploitation had instead created an unbreakable bond between us, a sisterhood forged in the fire of betrayal, but tempered by our collective determination to seek justice. The legal proceedings moved swiftly, once Marcus realized the overwhelming nature of the evidence against him. Rather than face trial, he accepted a plea agreement that resulted in a significant federal prison sentence and mandatory registration as a sex offender. The financial assets he had accumulated through his crimes were seized and distributed to his victims as partial compensation for the violation they had suffered. But the most meaningful outcome was seeing the women of our community reclaim their power and confidence. The gym reopened under new management, with additional security measures and a commitment to transparency that would prevent future violations. Many of the original members returned, drawn by the strength of the relationships they had built, and their determination not to let Marcus's crimes define their fitness journey. Sarah enrolled her daughter in the renovated facility, confident that the new safeguards would protect her from the kind of violation we had experienced. Jennifer became an advocate for other survivors of hidden camera crimes, using her experience to help law enforcement understand the psychological impact of such violations. Michelle channeled her anger into activism, working to educate young women about the warning signs of predatory behavior. As for me, I discovered that my greatest strength hadn't been physical after all. It was the determination to fight for justice when faced with overwhelming violation, and the ability to turn personal trauma into a force for protecting others. The woman who had walked into CrossFit Phoenix 8 months earlier seeking to rebuild her life had indeed been transformed, but not in the way I had originally expected. The final chapter of this story came 6 months later, when Marcus was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. As I sat in the courtroom listening to the judge detail his crimes and their impact on his victims, I felt a profound sense of closure and justice. The man who had believed we were powerless to stop him had learned that underestimating the strength and determination of women was the most dangerous mistake he could have made. Walking out of that courthouse, surrounded by the other women whose lives had been violated but who had found the courage to seek justice, I realized that Marcus had inadvertently given us something valuable. He had shown us that we were capable of far more than we had ever imagined, that our bonds of friendship could withstand even the most devastating betrayal, and that standing together we were indeed a force to be reckoned with. His workout had indeed gotten much harder, but our sisterhood had emerged stronger than ever before. The ripple effects of Marcus's downfall extended far beyond what any of us had initially imagined. Within weeks of his sentencing, I began receiving calls from attorneys representing women in similar situations across the country. Word had spread through legal networks about the comprehensive evidence we had gathered and the successful prosecution that resulted. Our case had become a blueprint for other victims seeking justice against predators who exploited their professional positions. The first call came from a law firm in Denver representing 12 women who had discovered hidden cameras in their yoga studio. The studio owner, much like Marcus, had maintained an impeccable reputation while secretly recording his students during private sessions and teacher training programs. The victims had been struggling to build a case because the owner had been careful to remove evidence before they could document it properly. I spent hours on the phone with their lead attorney, sharing the investigative techniques we had used and providing guidance on how to work with federal authorities. The conversation reminded me of my own feelings of helplessness when I first discovered Marcus's surveillance operation. Having someone who understood both the technical and emotional aspects of the situation made an enormous difference in their ability to move forward effectively. The Denver case became the second in what would eventually be recognized as a pattern of technology-facilitated exploitation in fitness and wellness industries. The yoga studio owner's operation was even more sophisticated than Marcus's, involving live streaming capabilities and an international customer base. The investigation that followed our consultation revealed a network of similar operations in multiple states, leading to one of the largest prosecutions of voyeuristic crimes in federal history. But the legal victories, while satisfying, were only part of the healing process. The deeper transformation was happening within our community of survivors, and in the relationships we had built with each other. The shared trauma that had initially brought us together had evolved into something much more profound and lasting. We had become family in the truest sense, bound by our collective determination to never again be victimized by someone we trusted. Sarah's advocacy work had caught the attention of national women's rights organizations, leading to invitations to speak at conferences and legislative hearings across the country. Her natural charisma and deep understanding of the issues made her an incredibly effective spokesperson for stronger privacy protections and enhanced penalties for voyeuristic crimes. Watching her transformation from devastated victim to powerful advocate was one of the most inspiring aspects of our shared journey. During one particularly impactful congressional hearing, Sarah testified about the long-term psychological effects of discovering that intimate moments had been recorded and distributed without consent. Her testimony was raw and emotional, but also filled with concrete recommendations for legislative changes that could prevent similar violations. Several committee members were visibly moved by her presentation, and the proposed legislation she was supporting gained significant momentum following her appearance. The bill that eventually passed, known as the Privacy Protection in Fitness Facilities Act, required all gyms and wellness centers to implement specific security measures, conduct regular sweeps for surveillance equipment, and provide clear policies about member privacy rights. More importantly, it established federal funding for training programs that would help fitness professionals recognize and report suspicious behavior among their colleagues. Jennifer's work with domestic violence survivors had uncovered disturbing connections between physical abuse and technology-facilitated stalking. Many of the women she counseled had discovered that their abusive partners or ex-partners had installed hidden cameras in their homes, vehicles, or workplaces as a means of continued control and intimidation. Her expertise in recognizing these devices and helping victims document evidence had made her an invaluable resource for law enforcement agencies dealing with complex abuse cases. One case that particularly highlighted Jennifer's impact involved a woman whose ex-husband had placed surveillance equipment throughout her new apartment after their divorce. The victim had been experiencing unexplained anxiety and the feeling of being watched, but couldn't identify the source of her discomfort. Jennifer's trained eye immediately spotted several hidden cameras during a security assessment, leading to criminal charges against the ex-husband and a restraining order that finally gave the victim peace of mind. The emotional intelligence that Jennifer had developed through her own recovery process made her uniquely qualified to help other women navigate the complex feelings that accompanied privacy violations. Victims often struggled with shame, self-blame, and a sense of powerlessness that could be more devastating than the actual surveillance itself. Jennifer's gentle but firm guidance helped them understand that the violation was not their fault and that they had the strength to seek justice and healing. Michelle's nonprofit organization had grown exponentially, expanding from local high school workshops to a national program that educated young women about digital safety and personal empowerment. Her age and direct experience with victimization gave her credibility with teenagers, who might dismiss warnings from adults they perceived as out of touch with modern technology and social dynamics. The curriculum Michelle developed addressed not just the technical aspects of privacy protection, but also the psychological tactics that predators use to gain trust and maintain control over their victims. Young women learn to recognize grooming behaviors, trust their instincts about uncomfortable situations, and seek help when they felt unsafe or uncertain about someone's intentions. One particularly powerful component of Michelle's program involved testimonials from survivors of various forms of exploitation. These women shared their stories not to frighten the audience, but to demonstrate that survival and recovery were possible even after devastating violations. The message of resilience and empowerment resonated strongly with young women who were just beginning to navigate complex social and professional relationships. The impact of Michelle's work became clear through the feedback she received from program participants and their families. Parents reported that their daughters were more confident about setting boundaries and more willing to communicate when they felt uncomfortable in social situations. Teachers noticed increased awareness among students about the importance of protecting personal information and being cautious about sharing intimate details with adults in positions of authority. Lisa's transition from fitness enthusiast to security consultant had been remarkably successful, driven by the unique perspective she brought to vulnerability assessment and risk management. Her technical expertise, combined with her personal understanding of how predators exploited trust relationships, made her consultations invaluable for organizations seeking to protect their clients and employees. The security protocols Lisa developed went far beyond simply detecting hidden cameras or other surveillance equipment. She helped organizations examine their policies, training programs, and cultural practices to identify potential weaknesses that predators might exploit. Her recommendations often included changes to hiring practices, background check procedures, and ongoing supervision that could prevent problematic individuals from gaining positions of trust in the first place. One of Lisa's most successful projects involved developing a comprehensive security program for a national chain of women's fitness centers. The program included regular technical sweeps for surveillance equipment, enhanced background checks for all employees, and ongoing training about recognizing and reporting suspicious behavior. But perhaps most importantly, it established clear protocols for taking member concerns seriously and investigating them thoroughly, regardless of how minor they might initially appear. The success of that project led to consulting contracts with other major fitness chains, spa organizations, and healthcare facilities that served vulnerable populations. Lisa's reputation grew rapidly within the security industry, and she began receiving invitations to speak at professional conferences about the intersection of technology, privacy, and personal safety. My own evolution had been perhaps the most unexpected. The investigative skills I had developed during my pursuit of Marcus, combined with my background in digital forensics, had opened up entirely new career possibilities. Law enforcement agencies began consulting with me on complex cases involving technology-facilitated crimes, and I discovered a passion for helping other victims navigate the process of gathering evidence and building cases against their abusers. Each investigation I worked on reinforced my understanding of how predators operated and the importance of taking a systematic approach to exposing their crimes. The techniques that had worked so effectively against Marcus were equally applicable to other situations, though each case required careful adaptation to specific circumstances and evidence availability. One of the most challenging cases I encountered involved a massage therapy clinic, where the owner had been secretly recording sessions with female clients for over a decade. The sophistication of his operation rivaled anything we had discovered at the gym, but the evidence was much more difficult to access because of the clinic's security measures and the owner's paranoia about discovery. Working with federal investigators, I helped develop a long-term surveillance operation that eventually gathered enough evidence to support search warrants for the clinic and the owner's residence. The investigation revealed thousands of recordings involving hundreds of victims, some dating back to the early days of digital video technology. The scope of the violation was staggering, but the systematic approach we had developed made it possible to build an airtight case that resulted in a significant prison sentence. The emotional impact of working on cases like this was considerable, but it was balanced by the satisfaction of seeing justice served and knowing that dangerous predators were being removed from positions where they could harm others. Each successful prosecution also contributed to a growing body of legal precedent that made future cases easier to investigate and prosecute. The media attention surrounding these cases had also created opportunities to educate the public about the prevalence of hidden camera crimes and the warning signs that potential victims should watch for. I began appearing regularly on news programs and podcasts, sharing information about how predators operated and what individuals could do to protect themselves from similar violations. These media appearances often generated additional contacts from victims who had been struggling in isolation, uncertain whether their experiences constituted crimes or whether law enforcement would take their concerns seriously. The validation that came from hearing their experiences acknowledged and understood was often the first step in their healing process, even when formal legal action wasn't possible or appropriate. The broader cultural impact of our collective work was becoming increasingly apparent as awareness of technology-facilitated crimes grew throughout society. Organizations that had previously dismissed privacy concerns as minor issues were now implementing comprehensive security measures and taking member complaints much more seriously. The legal precedents established by our cases had created financial and reputational risks that made ignoring potential problems a liability that few businesses were willing to accept. But perhaps the most meaningful change was happening at the individual level, as women became more aware of their rights and more confident about asserting them when those rights were threatened. The cultural narrative around victimization was shifting from shame and silence toward empowerment and action, creating an environment where predators found it much more difficult to operate with impunity. This shift was particularly evident in online communities where women shared information about suspicious behavior compared experiences with different service providers, and supported each other through the process of reporting concerns to appropriate authorities. The isolation that had once made individual victims vulnerable was being replaced by networks of mutual support and shared knowledge that made predatory behavior much more risky and difficult to sustain. The anniversary of Marcus's sentencing had become an annual milestone for our survivor community, but the gatherings had evolved beyond simple commemoration into celebrations of growth, achievement, and continued commitment to protecting others. Our most recent gathering included not just the original victims from CrossFit Phoenix, but also survivors from other cases we had worked on, and advocates who had joined our cause along the way. The diversity of our expanded community was remarkable, including women from various professional backgrounds, age groups, and life experiences, who had all been brought together by their shared commitment to preventing others from experiencing the violations they had endured. The conversation that evening ranged from personal updates about healing and recovery to strategic discussions about legislative priorities and advocacy opportunities. Sarah shared news about her recent appointment to a National Commission on Technology-Facilitated Violence, where she would help develop federal policy recommendations for preventing and prosecuting these crimes. Her expertise and credibility had made her a sought-after voice in policy discussions, and her influence was helping ensure that survivors' perspectives were centered in reform efforts. Jennifer announced that she had been accepted into a doctoral program in psychology, where she planned to focus her research on the long-term effects of privacy violations and the most effective therapeutic approaches for helping survivors heal. Her personal experience with trauma and recovery, combined with her natural empathy and intelligence, positioned her to make significant contributions to the field of victim services. Michelle had received a major foundation grant that would allow her nonprofit to expand internationally, bringing digital safety education to young women in countries where such resources were even more limited than they had been in the United States. The global scope of technology-facilitated crimes required international cooperation and awareness building, and Michelle's program would help create a network of educated and empowered young women who could protect themselves and others. Lisa's security consulting business had grown to the point where she was hiring additional staff and expanding into new markets. Her success had demonstrated that there was significant demand for specialized expertise in protecting vulnerable populations from technology-facilitated crimes, and she was training other consultants to meet that demand using the protocols and approaches she had developed. As for my own work, I had recently established a training program for law enforcement investigators that focused specifically on cases involving hidden cameras and surveillance equipment. The program combined technical instruction about detecting and documenting evidence with guidance about the unique psychological dynamics involved in these crimes and the specialized needs of victims. The response from law enforcement agencies had been overwhelmingly positive, with many investigators expressing gratitude for training that helped them understand the complexity and seriousness of crimes they had previously treated as minor privacy violations. The program was being adopted by police departments and federal agencies across the country, creating a new standard of professional competence in investigating technology-facilitated crimes. But beyond our individual professional achievements, the most significant impact of our journey was the model we had created for community response to predatory behavior. The combination of survivor support, systematic investigation, strategic legal action, and public advocacy had proven incredibly effective at not only bringing individual predators to justice, but also creating broader cultural and institutional changes that made future crimes less likely. This model was being replicated by other survivor communities dealing with different types of exploitation and abuse. The principles we had developed, taking victims seriously, conducting thorough investigations, building comprehensive evidence, coordinating with appropriate authorities, and maintaining focus on long-term prevention, were applicable to a wide range of situations where vulnerable individuals were being exploited by those in positions of trust. The legal precedents established by our cases had influenced prosecutions across the country, making it easier for other victims to seek justice and obtain appropriate remedies for the harm they had suffered. The civil settlements we had obtained had also created financial incentives for organizations to implement better security measures and oversight procedures, reducing the likelihood that similar violations would occur in the future. Perhaps most importantly, our success had demonstrated that ordinary individuals who found themselves victimized by seemingly powerful predators were not helpless. With determination, strategic thinking, mutual support, and appropriate professional assistance, victims could not only seek justice for themselves, but also create changes that protected others from similar harm. The transformation that each of us had undergone during this process was profound and lasting. We had discovered reserves of strength, courage, and capability that we hadn't known we possessed. We had learned that trauma, while devastating, did not have to define or limit us. We had found that our greatest power came not from individual achievement, but from our willingness to stand together and fight for justice when faced with violation and betrayal. Marcus had chosen to victimize us because he believed we were vulnerable, trusting, and unlikely to challenge his authority or expose his crimes. In that assessment, he had been catastrophically wrong. We had proven to be far more resilient, resourceful, and determined than he had ever imagined. The community he had tried to exploit for his own gratification had become a force for justice and change that extended far beyond our original boundaries. His downfall had been complete and permanent. The 12-year federal prison sentence meant he would lose the prime years of his career and emerge from incarceration as a registered sex offender, with limited opportunities for employment or social reintegration. The financial penalties had stripped him of the assets he had accumulated through his crimes, leaving him to face the future without the resources that might have cushioned his fall from grace. But more importantly, the exposure of his crimes had destroyed the reputation and credibility that had made his predatory behavior possible in the first place. He would never again be able to exploit a position of trust and authority to victimize vulnerable women. The community that had once respected and admired him now understood exactly who he truly was, and that knowledge would follow him for the rest of his life. The contrast between his situation and ours could not have been more stark. While he faced isolation, disgrace, and limited future prospects, we had built stronger relationships, discovered new capabilities, and created opportunities to make meaningful contributions to our communities and society at large. His attempt to exploit our vulnerability had instead revealed our strength, and his efforts to profit from our trust had ultimately led to his own destruction. The final victory was not just his imprisonment or the financial penalties he had suffered, but the knowledge that we had refused to let violation define us, that we had found strength in our shared experience, and that we were using that strength to protect and empower other women who might face similar threats. We had transformed from victims into advocates, from individuals into a sisterhood, from survivors into leaders who were helping other women find their own voices and power. That transformation was ongoing and would continue to evolve as we faced new challenges and opportunities. The bonds we had forged through shared trauma and collective action would remain strong throughout our lives, providing a foundation of mutual support and understanding that enriched every aspect of our existence. We had learned that our greatest achievements came not from individual success, but from our commitment to lifting each other up and creating a safer, more just world for all women. The story that had begun with devastating betrayal and violation had become one of empowerment, justice, and hope. Marcus's workout had indeed gotten much harder, but our lives had become more meaningful, more connected, and more powerful than ever before. We had proven that no predator, regardless of their position or apparent respectability, was beyond the reach of justice when faced with determined women who refused to accept victimization as their permanent status. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.